In this last video on the Era of Good Feelings, we'll look at some of the divisions that remained under the surface and ultimately contributed to the end of the Era of Good Feelings. As I've said before, to suggest that the dominant sense of unity and nationalism, was unanimous, that everybody, there were no agreements, would be to overstate the point. There were some disagreements below the surface, festering. And that's what we're going to look at here in this topic. As time passed after the War of 1812, you're going to really begin to see the growth of a merchant market economy, as I've said before. But this is also going to increase class differences and even a sense of class consciousness. Earlier, this really hadn't been as much the case. Earlier in the colonial period, for example, in the South, certainly, aristocratic plantation owners and poor whites sort of shared the same form of amusement. They all enjoyed gambling or cockfighting or horse racing. Now you begin to see, as the Era of Good Feelings passed, more Southern aristocrats looking at the low-class whites as, beneath them and avoiding them, that they're something separate. Of course, the growth of the merchant market economy increased class consciousness much more so in the North. Earlier in the North, almost all social classes freely drank alcoholic beverages, as part of their daily routine. Now, for the new wealthy merchant class, the ones that kind of own the merchant factories, they began to stress temperance. They began to look at alcohol as kind of low class. And of course, later in U.S. history, from these roots would grow the first temperance unions. Anyway, here's a quote from before the Revolution. Quote, "Men indulge in the general and pernicious habit of, in the morning, a draft of wine or rum. It, in conversation under such circumstances, was not likely to be brief. So no small part of the morning was wasted in this relaxation," unquote. People just drank a lot more earlier, and now this merchant class has begun to say this is unproductive. Before, rich people could afford servants, really kind of use them in the production of crops and for survival. Now the merchant class began to use them as status symbols, more like domestic labor. Domestic servants in time became a female occupation, I should note, a major source of these poor farm women coming to the cities, again embroiling themselves in the merchant market economy. In 1800, 40,000 free servants were employed in domestic labor, but by 1830, 200,000 were, so a tremendous growth there. Before the Revolution, there were often marriages between classes. Certainly many poor people tried to marry for economic advantage. But now the merchant wealthy class begin to show more of a social consciousness in the selection of their mates. They wanted somebody who would enhance their status and position in society. Elites tended to marry other elites to perpetuate their social and economic ties. In some cities, merchant parents encouraged their children to marry their cousins, the sons and daughters of their own brothers and sisters. In other cases, previously unrelated parents virtually exchanged several of their children. The most striking example was 4 daughters of the Cabot merchant family of Salem, Massachusetts, married the 4 sons of the Higginsons, a neighboring and equally prominent merchant family. The merchant class, a small but elite group, did all they could to solidify their wealth. They began forming what they called chambers of commerces, in a sense giving institutional form to their own emerging identity. They began to form more private trust funds for their children and grandchildren. The business owners would make it a point to hire as their managers only those from an equally prominent family. The poor began to perceive themselves as a distinct group as well, although they weren't organizing like the merchant class was. That would happen a little bit later, perhaps, with the formation of unions. But, the lower classes would congregate in bars and pubs and drink together, and they would complain about the rich guys and how unfair it was. So what you're seeing is you're really seeing the growth of class consciousness, and this class consciousness sort of was a crack in the American unity of the era of good feelings. It's going to continue to grow well past the era of good feelings, but you do see the beginnings of it as early as the 1820s. As I said, the growing class consciousness, the growing class differences were really just only small cracks in the 1820s. They would really grow as the Industrial Revolution grew in the middle of the 19th century and in the later of 19th century. But there were other events actually during the era of good feelings that threatened to reignite political tensions. The first was quite early in the era of good feelings. It was the infamous Panic of 1819, which I briefly referenced earlier. As we've said, the Second Bank of the U.S. had gotten a 20-year charter again, which it meant that it would exist until the middle of the 1830s, late 1830s. Anyway, the Panic of 1819 began when cotton prices collapsed, in part because of trade with Great Britain. British textile mills had been demanding huge supplies of American cotton, which drove prices up. At one point in 1818, the prices reached an unheard of 32 cents a pound. The price got so high, British textile mills began to use cheaper East Indian cotton, and thus the market for American cotton began to weaken and collapsed. At the same time, many banks, including the Bank of the United States, the Second Bank of the United States, had been given easy credit, loaning, in essence, too much money to too many people who perhaps were not good credit risk. And when the cotton prices collapsed, it led to a collapse in land values in other areas, which prompted people to rush their banks and demand their deposits back. With, of course, all the bank's money out with loaned to people who now couldn't pay because of the collapsing prices, banks and businesses were forced to close. People would rush to the bank, and this became known as the Panic of 1819. Anyway, this caused many people to blame the existence of the Panic of 1819 on the banks. In a sense, they would put a lot of blame on the Second Bank of the United States. So, the era of good feelings was just beginning, and they had rechartered the bank, this now Second Bank of the United States. But very early, people were realizing soon after that, geez, maybe we made a mistake, and they believed the Second Bank was part of this economic downturn. The Panic of 1819 then, in turn, led to another event that exacerbated tensions, the Tariff of 1824. The Panic of 1819 provoked calls for still higher tariffs from many manufacturers in New England, who still saw European manufactured or finished products as a threat. Now, as a result, the Tariff of 1824 gave much higher duties on foreign woolens, iron, and other manufactured goods. The Wealth in the South, who had basically given in the Tariff of 1816, was now, not going to give in so easily. These Tariff of 1824 were much higher, and thus the South and the West really protested more this time, but it was to no avail. Remember, Southern exporters would naturally worry about a trade war and increase foreign tariffs on their exports. And so the Tariff of 1824, unlike the one previously 8 years before, the Tariff of 1816, really exacerbated the tariff issue, splitting Americans and starting to crack in the era of good feeling. One of the final things that began to exacerbate tensions during the era of good feelings was the issue of slavery and westward expansion. And this is going to culminate in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Anyway, we've already talked about slavery in the Constitution, but after the Revolution, many northern states' constitutions eliminated slavery, stressing the Republican ideals of the Enlightenment. But of course, people in the South, where slavery was growing with cotton, they resisted that, and cotton became much more important to the economy as it grew southwestward into Louisiana and Arkansas. So people in the North saw slavery in the South as something abhorrent and un-American, and they wanted to get rid of it. Now, these numbers of people that felt this way were in the 1820s, I gotta admit, very small, but they were the emergent abolitionists. And we'll talk more about them, obviously, in American history and later in the 19th century as their numbers grew and the Civil War approached. But in the 1820s, they were a small but vocal group. Now, most people in the North were not abolitionists. That means that they didn't want to get rid of slavery everywhere like the abolitionists did. What they just wanted to do was stop it from spreading westward. They felt that if they tried to get rid of it everywhere like the abolitionists wanted, it would lead to a war. But, there's no reason that as the new states were added that they couldn't prohibit slavery from these new states. Now, Southern slave owners, however, they thought that slavery extending into the Southwest and in the West itself was, absolutely critical to the survival of slavery where they existed. Because in time, these Western territories would become states. And if those states did not allow slavery, that meant that the free states would have a majority in the Congress, and they could in future, at some time, outlaw slavery easily over all the United States. So the southern states really wanted to ensure that the western merchant states allowed slavery as well. In 1820, Missouri Territory applied to be admitted as a slave state. And this really upset the free states because in the Congress at the time, there was a 12-12 slave-free balance in the states. In Congress, Northern senators, they responded with the Tallmadge Amendment, which would have proclaimed no more slavery in Missouri and even the gradual emancipation of slaves already there. And of course, that's not going to pass. That's going to upset all the southern states. Well, into this problem came Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House and was soon known as the Great Compromiser. He had a way to settle the issue. He proposed what became known as the Missouri Compromise. At the time, Maine had been slowly populating. Maine had been technically part of Massachusetts, but it hadn't had enough people there to really be a separate state. But by this point, there were enough people, and he said, "Wait, there weren't slaves in Maine. Why doesn't Maine apply to be a new free state? And we could let Missouri, as they want, in as a slave state, and that would keep the balance at 13-13." And then Clay said, "Why don't we extend the southern boundary of Missouri, which is 36 degrees 30 minutes, westward throughout all territory of the United States, and above it would be forever free territory, and below it could be slave territory." Now, you might look at this map and you think, well, heck, the southern states got a broad deal here because they don't have as much territory. But, of course, the United States assumed that at some point they would take the Spanish territories to the west of that. And anyway, that was known as the Missouri Compromise, and it passed. It was the first time the United States federal government had dealt with the issue of slavery since the Constitution, and it kept the slave issue, at least temporarily, from leading to war. Of course, with the abolitionist numbers growing and with more and more territories in time applying to become states, the issue of whether these western states are slave or free going to reemerge and ultimately lead to the Civil War. In conclusion, the era of good feelings wouldn't last. There were, in fact, underlying political, social, economic, and geographical differences that were present throughout and would eventually sort of manifest themselves in politics and break up the era of good feelings. When you think of American political history, you often think of what's called the first political party system, the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. And that was two political parties that revolved around a set of issues that dominated the early republic. Well, the era of good feelings sort of ended that when the Federalist Party sort of dissolved. And out of the era of good feelings is going to become the second political party system as the opposition begins to emerge and new political issues are going to emerge. You're going to see a whole new set of parties forming. In any event, this concludes the series of videos on the era of good feelings.